I am Adam. If you haven't seen me on a previous session, I'm our head of customer success at Pando, and I'm joined here by Cassie, Enrique, and Leah, and I will allow them to introduce themselves, and then we will dive into our topic of the day. So, Cassie, will you go ahead and kick us off?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Veris. I am the Senior Director of Talent Development and Learning at Upwork. And for this icebreaker, for a scale of 1 to 10 for the transparency, I would say for compensation, we're probably actually closer to a 2 or 3. We're lower on that end. For promotions, we're trying to get higher on this. So I'll give us a 5.
Guess I'll go next. I'm Enrique Escusa. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEOs of Assemble, a compensation management platform that helps companies manage compensation end to end. As far as compensation transparency, we're very transparent, as you might imagine, given what we do. So I would put us at a 9. Where we don't show transparency is essentially other people's comp, but everything else is fully transparent across the board, end to end. And as for the performance or promotion process, we're probably like a 7. We'd like to be more transparent, but we're still working our way there.
I'm Leah Sate, Director of People Operations at Cylinder Health. We're a digestive health company. I am really excited to be here, and the transparency question is an interesting one because I joined the team about 4 months ago, and one of my big pet projects is increasing our transparency. I'd say right now our compensation program, kind of similar to Cassie, we're on the low end, probably around a 3 or a 4. Our promotion process, maybe a little higher in transparency. I think we're approaching a 6, maybe a 7. My goal is to get us firmly into that 7 or 8 territory by the end of the year.
All right, and our topic of the day is intentional inclusion, and so we've got transparency is part of that. But how do we keep compensation and performance development and sort of career progression equitable and fair? And so I've got we've got a whole set of questions. This first question is for everybody. Would love everyone's take. But what would you consider to be the core tenets of creating inclusive and equitable compensation and promotion cycles? Leah, kick us off.
Happy to kick us off. For anyone who knows me at all, I talk about accessibility a lot, and I think accessibility is absolutely core to every part of HR, definitely core to inclusivity when building your compensation and promotion cycles. And when I talk about accessibility, I really see 2 definitions of that. There's literal access to the systems. So thinking about, can people get to it? Can they see the benchmarking data? Can they see the salary bands? Can they see peer feedback? Do they know how to give it? Can they find the company's compensation philosophy? Is it written in a way that everyone can understand? Or is it in this really dense legalese? So the access in that sense. And then similar to that dense legalese, that kind of transitions to the second definition of accessibility, which is making sure that you are taking into account different learning and feedback styles. This is really more the inclusion side of accessibility. Some folks learn by doing, some learn by reading. In an earlier session today, I think Kelly was talking about how she prefers to get feedback in writing so that she can process it on her own, whereas other folks really want to have that 2-way conversation. They want to hear it in real time. So that's another element of accessibility that I think is really important in that compensation and promotion cycle, just knowing that people are going to respond differently and making sure that you're taking that into account.
Cassie, what do you think? Yeah, we talked about this
Leah,
earlier.
that's such a good answer. So for me, I actually think about this question more in a meta form, but the things that come to mind for me are really making sure that there is clarity and consistency about what your expectations are for promotion and therefore, things like performance when it comes to compensation. I think where I've seen the biggest traps in my career with these two and not having inclusive and equitable systems is where that clarity is not in place. And so one leader might think, oh, we have a leading promotion philosophy, and another might think we have a lagging promotion philosophy. And not having that documented, written down, easy to reference for managers makes that really hard to create this inclusive and equitable system. So it might seem basic, but having that in a really easy to find place in a clearly written down fashion so that people can all point to one thing when it comes to the guidelines and measuring stick for that you're using for your company makes a big difference.
I guess I'll chime in with a specific view on compensation and kind of provide 3 artifacts I think companies should have. And by the way, I agree with Leah and Cassie. And Cassie, to your point on things being written down, that's where we would start. So when it comes to compensation, there's kind of 3 really important elements we would encourage every company to have. The first one being a compensation philosophy. So kind of defining why are we approaching our compensation program the way that we are. And this is where you can be very intentional about certain trade-offs you might make and what things you're optimizing for. For example, some companies will not pay the same rates for different locations. Well, that's a very intentional approach to documenting it and then abiding by it. I think is really, really critical. So that's the first piece. The second being a job architecture, something I know Pando can really help with, but what are the different jobs we care about? How do we define what each of those levels or proficiency levels mean? And how will we actually measure where someone is in terms of their proficiency and performance within each of those roles, with higher levels having higher expectations? And then the last one is compensation bands. So what are we willing to pay for each of these jobs, and are there bands, or is everyone paid the exact same amount for a given job and location? Using these 3 to then inform each of your compensation decisions, I think leads to more equitable outcomes. So it's about not just building these out, but then also really enforcing them. One or the other is not enough. You kind of have to go through both.
And I've got a follow-up question for you, Enrique, just to continue on the theme of the compensation piece. But first, just a call out to people, the audience participating. Please, if you have questions as we go along, I mentioned this in the last session, but obviously applicable here, put them in chat. We'll either answer them right away or the panelists will answer them right away, or we'll come back to them later. But feel free to put questions in just as you have them, if you have them. So Enrique, just to go back and continue on the thread of compensation, talk to us about sort of compensation program design. How can organizations both design from the outset and then maintain as they grow an equitable compensation program or compensation system?
Yeah, this is something we obviously spend a lot of time thinking about and a lot of time talking to companies about this. So I would say the first and most important thing is to have those 3 items I recommended. And you can start really simple. This is not something you have to be super sophisticated around when you're a very small organization. But I think it's the intentionality and the practice of writing this out and going through the exercise that helps inform the program itself and then using that program over time. And I would say start simple and build complexity only as you need it. So for example, if you're a small 10-person team, you don't have to create compensation bands for 50 different jobs that you're not hiring for say the next 12 months. That's overkill. But if you know you have 5 software engineers and you're going to hire more, well, it behooves you to have a sense for how are we going to help these employees progress along their career, and what are we going to pay for the different levels of kind of software engineering as we see the world. What happens if we expand to a different location? Are we going to be paying a different rate? And if so, how are we going to inform how much of a difference we will pay in, say, Miami, where I'm based, versus New York City or San Francisco or some 4th city? And so really going through the process of first writing your compensation philosophy, then defining your jobs, and then building bands around those, hopefully with some accurate market data, although I have very strong views about why market data isn't perfect. I think it's a really good approach. And then to the extent that you can, start socializing this with decision makers. Who are the people that are going to be making compensation decisions? it's okay if in the early stages of a company, it's just a select few, but as you become larger, as you want to decentralize decision making, then training managers and recruiters on these items on your program and then leveraging it, not only does it lead to better outcomes, it also helps you save a lot of time and headaches down the line, where people know exactly why they're getting paid, what they're getting paid, and the conversation is more about the program itself as opposed to subjective conversations about why are you, my manager, giving me this raise or this number when I want something else.
Mhm. I'm not gonna derail the conversation this early on. I will later. But I'm writing out a question for bonus content at the end. What are your strong feelings on market data? And so we'll come back to that. But first, Cassie, continuing on that same theme, that's sort of around the compensation program. How do you apply, or what do you apply to performance systems and designing and maintaining fair and equitable performance programs from the very beginning through growth, potentially even high growth?
Mhm. Yeah, this goes back to my first point, which is that writing it down piece. I think Enrique and I are aligned on that. One thing that I will say I've seen mistakes in over my career so far has been when you're in periods of growth, switching up your system. And it can be really tempting as HR folks to constantly want to change that or tweak it. But that can feel very thrashy to employees and managers when they don't know kind of why the system is being changed or what's going on behind the scenes to get to that point. And so I found that in the periods of growth, like we were changing our system every 6 months to 12 months. And so every time we would get into a review cycle, which at that company was twice a year, employees were like, okay, we have a new rating system, a new feedback mechanism, a new way to write reviews. Like it just can get really overwhelming for them. And again, I know it's tempting to constantly make improvements, but one thing I found really helped was when I joined after seeing it change, 4+ times over the last 2 years. I said, okay, we need to be really intentional going into this next cycle. So had a conversation with the CEO, the COO, our head of people, really tried to say, like, what do we want this to look like? And let's try to be aspirational so that we can design a system that will grow with us over the next few years. And so that conversation led to promotion philosophy. What are the principles of promotion? How do we want to document promotions? How do we want to document ratings? How do we want to document performance? All of that. And so we put that in place. And then after that first cycle where we tried that out, we had a very intense retro where we actually sat down and say, okay, what worked? What didn't work? Let's communicate that now, what we're going to change in the next cycle so that employees have at least the next 6 months to digest that and know what's expected of them before we assess them again. And so that was much more well received than waiting until the cycle launched to tell them about the changes, which is what the team had done in the past. And I know it's hard when you're an HR team, you're constantly sprinting, you're constantly on to the next thing, but slowing down to do the thoughtful retro, make sure that we've aligned and updated any guidance of lessons learned, and then telling people right away about that made a big difference. So even though we can't prevent changes, like it's going to happen, the more you can communicate that in advance and make sure folks know the why behind it, it helps.
It makes me think back to what you had mentioned earlier around promotion philosophy, and I can't remember the exact verbiage you used, but do you promote ahead of, is it ahead of readiness or after? What was the phrasing you
Yeah,
used?
leading versus lagging.
And that would be, this person is ready to take on this new challenge, so I promote them into that even though they're not performing at that level yet, versus once they're already performing at that level, then promote them, right? So
Yeah.
it sort of makes me think of that, and in that there could be a philosophy of, do I implement a program that I think will grow into over the next year, or do I implement a program after we've already outgrown our past? And is there a right answer there? And that can be for anyone, is there a
Yeah.
recommendation on how to approach that?
I can chime in really quickly and then I'm curious to get other folks' thoughts, but I have had so many debates about what the right approach is when it comes to leading versus lagging. A lot of my career has been spent in lagging promotion cultures. And so Amazon is a really famous example of this, but they have a philosophy where you cannot be promoted until you've been operating at the next level for around 12 months. It's really a long period of time that you need to be showing you're already demonstrating performance at the next level, and the business need has to be there in order to get you to that next level. And so I will say, from a risk and tight budget perspective, that makes sense. Like, it's really being cautious with your promotion dollars and making sure you're not setting people up to fail because they get into a role and then they, don't meet the expectations when it comes time for the next review cycle. And so I can totally see the benefits of that. And I can see in a fast-paced, high-growth company that maybe wants to lean into their internal talent and really make it clear that we value internal mobility, where you'd want to go the other way and say, no, we're going to lean into folks and give them a chance and we'll support them, even if it's not perfect. That has to be an intentional decision, though. So where I think we get into traps is some teams want it one way and other teams want it a different way. And so, like, I'll tell you, for Upwork, like, we're being really explicit that we're actually going to go with a lagging approach. And that's because some teams were doing it and some teams weren't. And we're like, all right, we need to make this clear so that it's fair and equitable.
Yeah,
I've
I
got
just
a
want to echo
yeah,
I want to
Rika.
echo everything Cassie said. Just, I totally agree that I don't think there is necessarily a right answer. It's really going to depend on the organization, how companies are doing it, and making sure it's consistent across the board, making sure that you have a consistent company culture and a company working style, that this is how we make decisions, this is how it's done. Because I mean, the reality is employees talk to each other, and they should. And you don't want employees on one team saying, well, hang on, this person got a bump and got a promotion and they, barely are an L3 and they're already now moving into this role. And I've been operating as a team lead for a year, but I haven't gotten promoted. What's going on? You want to make sure that you're consistent across the board. And I've been in a lot of companies where our goal is always to get to that proactive place where we're like, yes, we can plan ahead, we can know what's happening. And for the first time, I'm in a company where we are intentionally operating reactively. And again, it goes back to that budget management, that risk management. Just given the market right now, that's an intentional choice we've made that we're standing behind. And I'm surprised at myself that I am comfortable and okay being in a reactive environment on purpose rather than one where it feels like we're just kind of struggling through this portion until we can get to a place of proactivity. But it so depends on the company culture and what you want to prioritize, and, like you said, Cassie, the risk that you want to take and kind of how agile your organization wants to be. And I think as long as you're clear with your employees, this is how it works, this is what our style is, then you're in a good place and there's not a right or wrong answer.
Cassie, I had never really heard this framing for performance or promotions specifically, but it's a very common thing to do when it comes to compensation. Are you lagging the market? Are you leading the market? So I really like it. And it's something that I'm now thinking, well, what are we doing at Assemble? And I think the weird thing is, like, we're somewhere in between. So when promoting someone, you can't be promoted into a job if you're not already displaying proficiency in some aspects of the job, but we don't fully expect full proficiency throughout, because then the way we see it is we've penalized the employee by making them wait too long and didn't allow for them to grow into the role while in the role. But we do use a framing, and this is maybe a bit more, goes to show that we're still early in our performance evaluation process, which is, if there's doubt, there's no doubt that you're not ready for it. And so we kind of use that as a proxy currently for saying, is there doubt that you're doing any of these things? And if there is, let's talk about those, and let's make sure that you can get rid of that doubt by displaying how you are meeting the expectations for this role. But we don't anticipate or expect a new employee getting promoted into a role to be fully operating at that perspective or at that proficiency level. So we're probably on the lagging too.
How do you apply, my follow-up question is, how do you apply that same philosophy, or is it appropriate to apply that leading versus lagging philosophy to rolling out people programs? Like, when you're thinking about a new program, or you're thinking about a leveling framework, or whatever it may be, do you say, I'm building this program we don't need it yet, but we're going to need it in a year, and I want people to be acclimated to it by the time it hits? Or do you implement a program after you already need it and after there's observable pain from the old program existing or the old way of doing things? Yeah, I'm curious if anyone has a philosophy on applying that to programs versus, yeah, promotion.
I don't think I have an intentional philosophy on this, Adam, but I'll tell you from a change management perspective, I find it a lot easier to roll things out when people have already experienced the pain. That said, if I could have avoided the pain, I probably would have, right? So if I knew what was going to avoid the pain, I would have loved to have put a better system in place. But this goes like oh man, again, it's so tempting to want to change this every time you do it because you learn so much from each approach or each process. And I really do think for employees to feel like it's fair, they need to have as much notice as possible to know what the expectations are. And so if you do that and it's like, okay, next month you're going to be evaluated on these things that we just rolled out, that's not going to feel good. So that's where, like, going back to Pando, like, I love that you're taking the approach of really need to say what is expected at each of these levels first before you even try to put a promotion framework on top of that. Because if you don't have clarity as to what's expected of each level, how can you know if someone's meeting that bar?
Yeah. Makes sense. I mean, I think about it from change management perspective and customer success as well. It's like when do you try to implement something? Is it post pain or is it in anticipation of? And it's hard to get people to make major behavior changes before they feel the pain requiring them. And then also, for better or worse, that pain does give you that more full picture of what people are experiencing and what you need to do about it. Anyway, told you I'd derail it. Anyway, okay. Leah, question for you. We've talked a lot about transparency already, and I think when we were doing our sort of prep for this session, you had brought up transparency in the promotion process in a way that I hadn't heard of before and really enjoyed. Will you talk us through sort of your philosophy around transparency in promotion process and the impacts that has?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, like I said at the top of the session, one of my real pet projects is increasing transparency across our organization. Coming in, I heard consistent feedback that it feels like promotion decisions and especially backfill positions. If someone senior leaves and we've got to move someone up into a team lead role, a project head role, a manager role, a senior role, how are those decisions made about who gets that backfill promotion when there's a business need? The consistent feedback I heard coming in was it feels like those decisions are made in a black box. We hear that someone's leaving, and then a couple weeks later, we hear, great, this person's moving into that role. And all of their peers say, how was that decision made? Did the manager just cherry pick their favorite? Did the manager just say, well, were there conversations that were being had in the back that I wasn't aware of? I didn't even get a chance to express interest. How, they don't feel good and they feel like they don't get a fair shot at moving up and growth. And obviously that can have a huge negative impact on overall engagement. And it's something that we see in our engagement surveys when people say, I don't really see what my career growth looks like here because it feels like the managers just kind of promote their favorites. So something I've implemented as, we just raised our Series B last year. And so we're going through a lot of growth and changes this year. And as people are moving positions, moving out, changing, promotion opportunities are coming up, I've been working with managers to build out a new promotion process where instead of saying, okay, great, we have this new position we need to fill, let's grab someone that we know is already interested because they came to me a couple months ago and said, hey, when there is an opportunity, I would love, a more senior role. I'd love a full-time opportunity because I'm part-time right now. Let's just grab those people who already came to us and bring them in. Rather than going that route, which is quick and efficient when you're a small organization, you need to be nimble, but as you grow, it's not necessarily scalable. We're building in a whole application process. So we have a whole internal job board. When there are job postings available, we post them internally. We make sure that everyone who's eligible is aware that those opportunities are coming. We say, hey, we've got a team lead position that's available. If you're at this level, if you're at least a IC level 3 or 4, whatever the opportunity is, you're eligible. If you've been here, your tenure is this much, your performance level is this much, then you're eligible. And if you're interested, here's how you apply. And it's not as necessarily as big an application as someone who's coming in externally, because we're doing it all internal. But we do go through a process that we've now done a couple of times and we're really proud of. We have a panel of interviewers who speak to every applicant. And then we've also put together a blinded exercise project where the manager, the hiring manager, will put together a case study project that, let's say it's something like, hey, pick an issue that you see on the team right now and let us know how you would fix it. And don't spend more than 45 minutes on this. We are not going to use this. We just want to see kind of how your thought process works. That gets sent into one email address. The names are stripped from all of those, and those projects then go to the hiring committee to review. And that has worked so well and so interestingly, because we have then the interview scores and these blinded case study scores, and those together help us make the decision about who to promote. And we recently did this, and we had some surprise answers, and it was really, really great to get to see a whole different level of people's thinking styles. It helped us make a less biased decision. And even if the decision we ended up making is the same one we would have made, we got feedback from employees as they were sending in their applications, as they were sending in their case studies. Hey, I really appreciate the opportunity to get to do it this way. I really appreciate the consideration. And that way, at the end of the process, even if the result is, unfortunately, you didn't get this promotion, they feel like they got a fair shot. And people really, really value that opportunity and that transparency. It's no longer a black box. It's no longer this big question mark of how are these decisions being made. They feel like they have some ownership of their career in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah, I love that example. I had not heard that before. Similar to what you would make with an external hire, but a little bit more streamlined. Sarah asked a question of you. How big's your organization? How many employees?
Right now, we're right around 150 employees.
Cassie, I know you have thoughts on transparency in the promotion process and sort of strategies. Will you share with us?
Had to unmute myself. Yes, Leah, I love your example. I wish we were at that place to do the same, but I have had challenges with internal mobility at past organizations. And this just goes back to, before I answer your question, Adam, all these systems are connected and related. And so one thing that as HR professionals, we probably all struggle with, I actually just faced this, was when we were making decisions about our promotion philosophy and what we wanted it to be and how we wanted to think about it. We're like, wow, we're setting a pretty high bar for this. Like, this is going to be a challenge. And managers, yes, like we want them to be open if that makes sense. And there's a business need to tell employees whether or not they're putting them up for promotion. We also need to look at our hiring process, because we don't want it to be easier to get hired in externally than it is to get promoted internally. So how are we making sure that those same guardrails, those same philosophy pieces are woven into our hiring practices? It's really hard. It's not an easy question to answer, but being thoughtful and making sure you're looking at each of these processes to see, like, is it easier or is it actually more challenging? And what do we want it to be? And how do we want to think about that? Having those intentional conversations, so important. Can't stress that enough. And then for the promotion transparency piece, this might be a little controversial, but the organizations I've worked at, we've actually erred on not being as transparent when it comes to promotion. And again, I think it's just really being intentional about what you want and why. And so we can tell managers and employees why that is the case. But for us, the main reason came back to, we really want people to be honest in their evaluations when giving the promotion forms, when they're filling those out and writing their scope justification, the reason why they think they're ready, gathering feedback from stakeholders. We want people to be giving really well-balanced perspectives. And we noticed that when we were allowing employees to see that, that people weren't being as honest. And so this was a really intentional decision that we said, okay, we're going to make these confidential, not shared with the employee, these promotion documents, and instead make it only manager facing and committee. So promotion committees can see these. And so not everyone's going to like it. That's the reality, but we decided to do this because we wanted to be really sure that we were getting those well-balanced, honest perspectives. And we felt people were holding back if they knew the employee was going to see it. So it goes back to like, you just have to be intentional. No, there's no right answer.
The people writing those would be the employee's manager. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, go ahead.
Yeah, can I chime in with a quick comment? Cassie, I actually love one of the things you said, which is it may not be right or may not be right for everyone, but at least you're clear and intentional. And I think that that's so important. It's similar to culture or a job description or the compensation bands. Like, it's not something that everyone needs to love and like, but it needs to be very clear and intentional. There will be people who see the job description and say, this isn't the job for me. And that's like perfectly okay. But at least they're clear on what the job is. Similarly with compensation, they might say, wow, I want a higher compensation package for this role based on my experience. And that's okay to want that. But if the company is clear and intentional about this is the number that we as a company can pay for whatever reasons, that at least avoids the ambiguity that might exist. So I'm really glad that you said that.
Yeah, just adding in, I think transparency has so many different definitions, but I feel like transparency about your transparency intentions is really the key thing. And as long as you're clear, like you said, Enrique, some people might decide like, I'm opting out, this is not for me. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You want to make sure that you're building a culture that works for your organization and that everyone there is supported by that culture. And if it's not the right fit for them, then they can, move on gracefully, or they can disagree and commit, or whatever that looks like. But if you're clear about this is what it's going to look like here, then people can make the right decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I would call that a feature, not a bug, right? Like, for example, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about pay transparency and being clear with candidates and even employees, like this is what we're willing to pay for the range, is you avoid the really uncomfortable situation of going through a whole recruiting process. You get to the end, you love the candidate, they love you, and then you reveal, and this is what we're willing to pay. And they say, I can't accept that, it's too low. Well, if you had done this at the front, you would have spared each other that long process, which took away time from the candidate and from your company. And similarly with employees, you don't want an employee to be disappointed at the end of that promotion process if they have some level of transparency, whether it's company-wide or conducted through a manager. You can really spare yourself and the employee from that really uncomfortable conversation that could lead to something worse. Because one thing I've seen is companies aren't transparent about this. They go through a promotion process, they promote the employee, and they get like a 1% raise, and the employee's like, okay, thank you for the title, but now I'm going to go recruit elsewhere now that I am a senior, software engineer or something like that. So it totally backfires. Sorry, I got really passionate over that one.
No, I actually want to go back, if with your permission, crew, to an earlier topic that we were talking about, and I almost forgot what it is. Oh yeah, so we were talking about internal promotion versus external hire. And on the topic, on the theme of equitable, inclusive, and fair, does internal versus external come into play? How do you manage that decision on whether to hire within versus externally? Is it the most fair thing to do to open it up to both and have candidates compete? Yeah, how do you make that decision on whether to open a job up, especially a backfill? Going back to your earlier example, Leah, how do you decide whether to open that up only internal versus both internal and external, or only external? And what are the implications?
I mean, this is where I feel like that blinded exercise is really helpful if you do open it up to both, because again, it helps you make the decision about who's the best person for this role. And maybe it's really, really important that that person have a lot of institutional knowledge, and the best person for the role is going to be someone who is internal and knows things. about the company and the history. But maybe someone's going to come in with an exercise or a case study that will surprise you and that'll have a really different perspective. I always say that my favorite people to work with are people who are smarter than me and know things that I don't know. So I love that opportunity to work with someone who comes in without the historical bias and burden necessarily of that organization of this is how we've always done it. Someone to come in with a fresh perspective can be really valuable. So depending on the role, I think opening it up to both and then doing that case study exercise can be really, really helpful to figure out what is going to be the right perspective for this role.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, as you should, you start with the requirements for the role. And if one of those requirements is deep institutional knowledge, then that's a pretty easy answer. But if it's not, then potentially that's an easy answer as well.
Absolutely.
Makes sense. Enrique, I'm curious how, from a comp perspective, the going sort of knowledge or advice is if you want to raise, you go to a different company. And how do you approach that or combat that? Or do you?
Yeah, well, so I'll give my answer for how we do it at Assemble, and then a more kind of general overview of what I see other companies do. So at Assemble, every employee has access to their Assemble instance, of course, where you can see your compensation philosophy, your job architecture, your comp bands. And so it's very clear to every employee, like what is my earning potential if I stay within this role, if I stay within this company, if I get promoted. And so the conversations for us are a lot more of, is there a business need for this promotion? And if so, what would it take for me to be qualified for that role? And so we have very transparent and open conversations about it. And I constantly ask all of our employees, like, why would you leave Assemble? And if the answer is, I feel like I'm not being compensated enough, then we can have a conversation of, is our program falling behind for one reason or another? Or is it, something that's out of our control, something that we're unwilling to change? For example, one of our employees, former employees a couple of years ago told us, hey, I want to buy a home and I need a lot more in cash. And we had an open conversation about what they were looking for. And I was honest. I told them, look, for an early stage company like we are, we're not going to match what you could earn at a big tech company. And so if this is really important for you, I understand it. I support you in your personal pursuits, but I'm not going to change our program to allow you to earn more so that you can buy a home. So if this is the end of your journey at Assemble, let's have an open conversation about it. I will help you in however way I can land you one of those jobs. And then in exchange, please help us find your backfill so that we don't suffer as a team. It's not easy to do that. And there are times where employees will not be as transparent and forthcoming as you would want them to be. But I think showing that and using that as an example has helped other employees be more open. Now, that is Assemble for Assemble. I think for other companies, it's not the approach that they take. And I understand the reasons why you wouldn't want to be as transparent. Maybe you don't have a program fully set up. Maybe your managers are still very nascent and early in their careers. They don't have the experience to have some of these conversations openly. And so it is kind of a journey working towards that. And what we see be kind of the most common, or maybe like common and preferred approach, is telling employees we have 2 times throughout the year where we evaluate promotions and compensation adjustments. This is what you might expect. The constraints might be the budget that we're given by the finance team or the board or the leadership team. And maybe there's, a promotion process we have to abide by, and that would be great. And so kind of then shifting the conversations over to, if you want to get promoted, it happens in June and December. This is the process. We will need to have evidence that you're performing at this role, so on and so forth. So let's work towards building that evidence, but understand that as a manager, I can make the request and it needs to go through the approvals of, director of the department, HR team, finance team, and so on. And so at least as a manager, you can build that process or approach with the employee. That I would say is like probably the most common approach we see companies take.
It makes me think. So one of the topics that we kept coming back to, sort of in preparing for this session, was around obviously transparency and making best efforts to be equitable, inclusive, and really accurate in compensation decisions and programs and promotion processes. but that sometimes even the best sort of intentions can backfire as you get down the road and you sort of see the impact of some of the programs that you've laid out. So, Cassie, I want to go to you and talk about sort of times where, or an example of a time where the pursuit of equitable compensation or transparency maybe, had gone wrong and what you may have done differently, reflecting back on it now.
Yeah, I have many examples of this. There's two that I'll share. My last company was a startup, and so in 2020, when everyone was dealing with the craziness of COVID and the pandemic and how to handle that, we knew we needed to preserve our cash, and so we decided to do this program where we actually gave employees the option to exchange cash for equity. At the time, it was a great cash saving mechanism. And we told people, we will make you whole at the next review cycle. We just need this for a year. And as you can imagine, that was not the best decision because it led to a bunch of inequity when it came to our equity. So we had folks who were higher earners opting into that, or maybe their spouse was making more money and they could afford to cut down on their cash and then got this huge sum of equity. And then the next cycle came around and we said, again, we'd make them whole. And so we had them getting back to their old cash, but then they also had this extra equity. And for years, we were constantly, as a comp team, struggling with like, okay, how do we want to handle these folks who opted into this program that we probably should have never have done? So anyway, just goes back to like, we made a decision in the heat of the moment. We really should have thought through the downstream impacts of that. And then the second one was actually later when our startup was later stage, and we were also kind of trying to preserve cash before a fundraise round. And we had to make a decision because we couldn't afford to give everyone at the company performance bonuses or performance raises. And so we said to each leader, like, you have your rating systems, you have this set budget, you decide how you want to use it. And at the time, we thought, oh, this is empowering them. This is great. You can imagine every leader handled that differently. We had some leaders giving everyone in their organization a 5 out of 5 on the rating scale because they're like, I can't give them cash, so I'm going to give them a really positive rating. And so that led to a ton of confusion. Folks feeling like, why is it easier to get a strong rating in this team than this team? Because of course people talk, they share that information. And then we had others who said, okay, we're not going to give anyone any cash raises, but we're going to put it all towards promotions. And so they had all these people in their teams getting promotions when the rest of the org wasn't getting promoted. And so anyway, it goes back to like we were trying to do best by that limited budget, but didn't really think about when you do take away that consistency of how you're applying these frameworks. When leaders are left to their own devices, sometimes it doesn't go so well. So yes, I think it can absolutely backfire if you're not really careful.
Leah, I think you had a couple examples as well, if you are, willing and able to share.
I mean, I don't know that I have specific examples, but just kind of echoing the point that pay and equity can really come from a good place. It can come from good intentions. It's not always malicious. Enrique was just giving the example of, if an employee comes to you and saying, I'm trying to buy a house and I need more cash. You can have a manager who might say like, you know what, you're a great employee. I want to help you out. I want to make sure you stay. I want to keep you happy and engaged. And I'm going to, match that, what you're asking for. I've had managers come to me and say, hey, this person, just had a kid, or they moved into an expensive apartment, or they're going through a divorce. They could really use our help. And I have to remind managers that our help doesn't have to come in the form of an increase to their salary. We can give them flexible working hours. We can give them grace. We can guide them towards the benefits and perks we offer. We can be, a caring ear to them. We can be all these things to them without necessarily pushing them outside of their salary band. And I have to remind managers, maybe you only have one person in this position today. Again, I've spent a lot of my career in these growing Series B companies. You have one person in this position today. Is that scalable? Think about where we're going to be in 5 years when you have a team of 20. Can you pay everybody that rate? And if you can't, and that one person is still here making that higher rate, how is that going to make sense to the other people on the team? Because you can't assume that no one's going to share their salary with each other. They will, they should, they have the right to. And like we've been saying, people will talk, and you need to make sure that you're consistent. And even though it seems hard, and even sometimes managers have said, well, this feels mean to say, like, oh, well, I can't give you a raise even though I know you're buying a house. I have to remind them it's a gift to do this kind of equitable, thoughtful process to set this out and say, we're going to make sure that we're doing things fairly. And again, we can make sure that you've got flexibility to go sign all the documents you need to sign and go to your closing. And if you need to schedule your inspection at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday, go do that. But we need to make sure that the salary bands are consistent across the board because you have to think about the scaling. I know we're going to talk more about HR debt in a little bit. And the metaphor that I love coming back to is the metaphor of building a house. Once you have your foundation, it's much easier to set up the plumbing and the electrical before you drywall and paint. You have to go in the right order. So you want to think about that plumbing and electrical as your compensation philosophy, making sure that you build that before you close it all in. And then suddenly you have to reopen walls because you've grown. And now you're like, well, everything we built doesn't make sense anymore. We've got to remove all these galvanized pipes. We've got to put in, I don't know enough about plumbing, but you've got to build things in the right order to make sure that as you scale, you're ready.
Okay, we have about one more session's worth of stuff to talk about, and only a couple minutes left to talk about it in. I'll leave it to you three to decide our last topic. There's a question here from Sophie, and then the concept of HR debt, I think, is a really great one as well. So I'm curious if we can fit in both. Can we give Sophie a quick answer? Maybe Enrique, you want to weigh in there, and then would love to hear quick thoughts on HR debt before we sign off and give a break before the next session.
Yeah, I'll chime in and I'll try to be quick. So Sophie, great question. This is something that became really popular, especially as companies were looking to hire aggressively. I think in most cases, it's a bad idea. And I'll say most cases because there are times where it works really well. Where I think it doesn't work well is when there's no program in place and where this is a high volume role. That combination of ingredients creates a really bad future situation. What I mean by that as an example is, let's say that you're hiring 5 to 10, let's say customer support roles or engineers. When you start to offer different choices, each of those employees will pick what works best for them at that point in time. Fast forward a year or 2 years from now, each of those employees now have different compensation mixes, if you will. And it's very common that companies forget why Mary picked the high equity package and has a much lower salary versus John. And you look at those two and you say, wow, we're underpaying Mary. We have to give her this huge raise. And oftentimes it's because you forget that there was this high equity offer that she picked. Let's say you do bring her up to that. Well, what happens is that since then, maybe you've raced another round, we can't give that same amount of equity to John. And all of a sudden, Mary and John have the same salary. Mary has more equity. And there's not really anything you can do to unwind that. And so you can find yourself in the future with really difficult situations to unwind. Now, where I've seen it work well is when you are very intentional about this at a company and you place some constraints. It's not like you can say there's these huge swings between how much cash and equity you have. And it works especially well in roles where you're not hiring a lot of them. So for example, a director of product marketing, you're probably only going to hire one, or at least for a long time. And so giving that one role flexibility within some constraints can work well because you're not going to run into that same issue. Although you have to be mindful of looking across everyone in the marketing department or looking across all of our directors. Are we creating or inserting any issues for ourselves? So to be safe, I would advise against it, but if you need to use this in order to close a candidate that's really important, ask yourself, are we going to be intentional about this? Are we okay with the potential risks and trade-offs? And if this is a high volume role, do we really need this, or can we actually be more steadfast about and more consistent about what we pay for this role?
I think it's also a great example, a very real example of HR debt. It's a decision that you make that you don't realize or you don't feel the impact of until a year, 2 years down the road, and then it becomes very hard to unravel that. And I think if we can, I'm going to steal 2 more minutes. I guess when my question, how to choose, the question I think that I'd love to hear thoughts on is how do you choose when to intentionally take on HR debt? If you can provide a quick framework, and then how do you prepare to pay that debt down?
I'll jump in
Okay.
and I'll keep it brief. I would say understand how long until you pay that down and how costly is this debt. So, for example, if you are handing out titles, well, hiring your first manager for a role and giving them a VP title, really dangerous if you don't think that this person can grow into that role and the business can grow into the needs of that role within, let's say, I don't know, 12 months, 18 months. Now, if you are hiring a manager and giving them the head of title, this manager has experience and you think they can grow into that role and the business will need that, that's a very different set of circumstances you're finding yourself into. So I would say like, look at how long until you put this down and what will it take for you to pay it off.
Mhm. Leah, Cassie, do you want to weigh in before we say our goodbyes?
I don't know that I have necessarily advice on how to figure out paying that down. Just I do think the conversations we've had about HR debt, it's something that I think a lot of people can forget about, especially when you're early and you're growing and you think, oh, well, a title doesn't cost anything. Again, it goes back to that house metaphor. Maybe it doesn't cost anything today, but what will that look like as your team grows? And make decisions today as much as possible that will set you up for success in 12 to 18 months. So if you're hiring someone and you're like, oh, sure, they really want a director or VP title, we'll just give it to them. What's that going to look like in 18 months when the team is bigger and that person has 2 layers of management above them? And now you need to change their title. And functionally, it might feel to them like you're demoting them. What does that look like? How is that going to play out? I've seen that happen where, you hire someone, they want a director title, give it to them. You then say, we actually don't need a director level and we need to change your title, and they leave. And you've got to think about what's the trade-off there.
Most people are familiar with this now, but we talked about this in our prep session. Amazon has the concept of one-way and two-way doors, and this is so applicable for HR because a lot of the decisions, like titles or comp, like those are one-way door decisions. Not that you can't reverse them, but it's really painful and it's not an ideal experience. So try whenever possible to make quick two-way door decisions where it's easy to reverse, not going to be super painful, and be slow and meticulous before deciding that you're going to do a one-way door decision because you might be paying for it 4 years later if you don't think through the long-term implications.
Cool. Okay. Well, we are a little bit over time. We could have gone on and on and on, and hopefully we have a chance to do so again. This was a really great discussion. I really appreciate everyone who joined, and Enrique and Cassie and Leah, thank you so, so much for your time and your advice. Thank you. And we will see you all in the next session in about 4 minutes.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.